Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Mike Logan, and this is for Philosophy 105 and Ethics 105, summer session 2024 at Lehigh University. Um, Today is the 26th of July, Friday. I'm going to be talking about Ernest Gellner's essay, What is a Nation?, which is kind of the centerpiece of his famous book called Nations and Nationalism, and that is from 1983. This is considered a classic theory of nationalism, what it is, and how it operates in the modern world. So um, now the vocabulary words and the main concepts and things that I want you to take away in terms of um, phrases and definitions of words and things like that are all in glossary number 2, which is posted on course site. And that's, of course, what you should study to do well on the final examination. And so my remarks about the text are, as I have said before, meant to just help you with your critical reading about how these arguments are built by these authors, and to just reflect a little bit on what the main ideas are, and just to put them into our own words a little bit too. So let's begin. He starts with the title of the essay, What is a Nation? And he starts with the idealist definition of a nation, which has to do with this concept of national will. So go all the way back to the state of nature, right, with Thomas Hobbes, and people get together and they make a social contract, and then they have um, and then they function as a group, right? And that's an act of will on the part of individuals who all individually say that are going to will this to happen, and the group then has a collective will to perpetuate itself and to um, uh, keep doing what it's doing, right, and keep existing, first of all. And so that's what the idealist notion of a nationalism is based on, that there is a national will that is peculiar to that one nation of people and no other one. Okay, so on pages 52 and 53 of Gellner's book, he says this about will and fear. And so I'm going to show you a whiteboard now to show you how this works. Let me open the whiteboard first of all, and then I'll share my screen. Um, okay, so as you can see here, this whiteboard that I was working on earlier, we'll start at the bottom on this one. So we have our idea of the nation. And so the idealist definition of the nation is this thinking about a national will and being kind of the essence or spirit of the nation. And so over here we have individual will and collective will, like I just explained. And on the other side of this, we have a more Hobbesian idea about what a nation is. Um, it's not just this spirit or will on the part of people in a group. It's um, it's a social contract, a kind of group behavior that depends on an external civil power. So extraneous incentives. That's a phrase that comes from Gellner, actually. And civil power, of course, is a phrase that comes from Hobbes. And so you have these extraneous powers. A civil power is like law enforcement, right? Or an authority. So that's an extraneous power, extraneous to the individuals and extraneous to the actual group of people who are living and benefiting from the social contract. They actually agree that there's going to be some exterior person who oversees all of them, right? So the extraneous incentives can be negative, right? They could be just a matter of fearing the police or fearing the authority and just fearing their sheer physical power over you. Or they could be something positive, like an extraneous incentive can be, let's say, a profit motive. So, the social contract benefits you because you can do business better and accumulate more wealth for yourself that way, a kind of positive incentive. Hoping for wealth is an extraneous incentive, just like fearing an authoritarian civil power is an extraneous incentive. They're both extraneous incentives, one being positive, one being negative, right? So you have extraneous incentives, positive and negative, that are working together with the individual wills of the people because they are a thing, and the collective will of the group of people that wants to have a social contract and wants to have the beginnings of a nation. That's still a thing too. And all of these things taken together, um, well, they can exist on a kind of spectrum, right? Sometimes you have an absolute authority or just, one tyrant who's controlling everyone. And then you have the beginnings of a nation, but it's very one-sided in terms of everyone's voice and relative power in a situation. But that's another question here. The other side of the spectrum is having something like a truly collective will that's expressed collectively, and everybody has a voice in that collective, and something more like a democracy, right? So something between a democracy, a true democracy, and a tyranny. Uh, uh, all of that is a spectrum of the beginning of what a nation can be with a social contract, right? So this is how we're building the theory of the nation here, according to Gellner. So you have a Hobbesian social contract now, and once you have that, you can have a culture, and you can have human societies can start building things, and they can also start um, religious organizations too. And so I have religious groups here kind of floating in the middle there, right at the beginnings of culture, because it is always there right at the beginnings of any culture, and it does influence the national will and the collective will. Usually the will and the collective will in that idealist definition have something to do with religious beliefs and religious culture and people's agreeing on their theology and agreeing on their religious beliefs, their spiritual beliefs, right? And those things are leaning a little bit more towards will and collective than they are towards extraneous incentives. Which you tend to think of religious things as personal things, as well as social, right? So once you have that Hobbesian social contract, you can have a nation state. The extraneous and said the technologies and the society can advance, and it can develop technologies and advance its industries and build things. And that's why you have uh, that growth of the nation on this side, on the right hand side, the sort of physical, material, mechanical, industrial, technological nation is possible. Then on the other side of that, you have the individual society and people's, individual intellects and sentiments and emotions and feelings and philosophies, and all of the humanities develops into what Gellner calls a high culture. Now, the high culture, according to Gellner, is, and he says this on page 55, 54 rather. A high culture is then also possible. Now, what is that? Now, the high culture is a culture that belongs to the newly advancing technological society. Now, the modern society. Now, remember, Hobbes was right there at the beginning of modernity, really. Um, the early stages of modernity, developing his secular political philosophy and his ideas about Leviathan and the way nations and states and very large groups of people behave collectively, all as one organism, as it were. That is the nation state for Hobbes. A high culture for Gellner is the culture that grows out of that big nation state, which is bigger than any one regional folk culture. So before you have a modern nation state and you have that big of a collective behavior among people, you have a bunch of folk cultures, regional cultures, which um, exist in a plurality, right? So you have true cultural pluralism. So the high culture is something that replaces cultural pluralism. So it's something that really serves to push out what existed before it. And it works like this. Gellner says that these, quote, general social conditions are what, uh, quote, makes for standardized, homogeneous, centrally sustained high cultures pervading entire populations and not just elite minorities. When these general social conditions arise, quote, a situation arises in which well-defined, educationally sanctioned and unified cultures constitute very nearly the only kind of unit with which men willingly and often ardently identify, right? So the high culture is that um, shared modern culture that shares a language and shares ideas, and it's sustained by this by a homogeneous society, by a large group of people who are beginning to resemble each other more and more because they are in communication with each other more and more, because society is advancing more and more, and technology and industry and commerce are developing more and more, and communication is developing more and more, and so that people begin to look more and more like each other. Now, um, Gellner's word for the people who function within this giant collective, his phrase for them is atomized individuals. And so on page 56, he says, quote, it is the establishment of an anonymous impersonal society. Now, the anonymous impersonal society is sustained by the high culture, right? The anonymous impersonal society with mutually substitutable atomized individuals held together above all by a shared culture, the high culture of this kind, in place of a previous complex structure of local groups, cultural pluralism, sustained by folk cultures reproduced locally and idiosyncratically by the microgroups themselves. That is what really happens. All right. So what he says really happens is the high culture replaces the cultural pluralism that existed earlier and advances along with the advanced industries and technologies that make up the new modern nation state. And so that modern nation state becomes what Hobbes calls a leviathan, a very large group of people behaving similarly. And see, if you look at the cover of Gellner's book, and my version of it has this painting, this sort of Kandinsky abstract modern painting and it says Berlin, which I think is the title of the painting. And I won't go looking for the artist's name right now, but the reason I'm showing it to you is because it has these images of these kind of atomized individuals, little people who all look the same, little tiny cogs in the machine. They're all following each other up a kind of industrial mountain there of buildings and power plants and towers and power lines and things like that, right? So that's just a sort of, this is a 1983 book when it's not too many years after what was considered, sort of high modernist period where a lot of philosophers started talking about this kind of groupthink and the way that mass communications could control societies, right? So out of this advanced kind of technological society and its high culture, you get, on the one hand, culturally, you get nationalist ideology, right? And it's nothing other than itself anymore. It doesn't really refer to religion anymore. It doesn't really refer to a national essence anymore. In fact, it makes more sense to take this here and move it up, take the word nation here and put it at the top, because what Gellner ends up saying is in these kind of conditions, the nationalist ideology here on the one hand and the social control or the mechanisms of a leviathan that controls society in so many different ways. These things function together to create ethical imperatives for the whole nation. And so people feel an ethical imperative. They feel it's scandalous, quote unquote, scandalous to go against what the quote unquote herd is doing, right? Um, Being a nonconformist makes you a deviant, and makes you an eccentric, makes you, a weirdo, and targets you with criticism and maybe even violence on the one hand. And then the nationalist ideology is telling you that it's the right thing and the good thing and the noble thing to go along with the ethical imperatives of the nation. So the nation is engendered by the nationalism. And that's the big sort of profound statement. And the reason why Gellner is famous for this book is because what he says on page 54 is, quote, "It is nationalism which engenders nations and not the other way around," unquote. So it's the nationalism and the modern nation state and its produced ethical imperatives, if you will, that nationalism that feeds the nation and creates it and engenders it, right? Gives it its life. Uh, okay, and so that's Gellner's basic theory of the nation. I have a couple other notes here. Um, After that, Gellner talks about the self-worshiping quality of that nation. Like I said, it's nothing other than itself anymore. And so he says that it kind of takes the place of religion in a modern secular nation state. He says, quote, "Society no longer worships itself through religious symbols. A modern, streamlined, on wheels high culture celebrates itself in song and dance, which it borrows from a folk culture." Okay, so what do you mean folk culture? I thought it was high culture. Well, he says, here's another profound thing. Is he says that what really happens is the high culture replaces the cultural pluralism of the past. And what it does is it adopts an avatar of some older folk culture and says, that's the real nation. So depending on where you are, that avatar can be different. But that's the word that he uses on page 55. That nations use quote unquote avatars at the top of 55 to embody the high culture, which is, quote, a previous complex structure of social groups sustained by folk cultures reproduced locally and idiosyncratically by the microgroups themselves. That's what really happens. The high culture pushes out the cultural pluralism, but it does so wearing the avatar, wearing the mask of some other folk culture. Okay, if you have any questions or things that I can clarify or anything else about Philosophy 105 this summer, please let me know. I'd be very happy to help you out. Reach out to me by email or any other way contact me. Okay, so take care. I will be making one more instructive video about Smith next week. Okay, have a nice weekend, everyone.